Is this there? Great. Thank you so much. So my name is Mariano de la Masa, and I would first like to thank Caroline and all of CCNet for giving me the chance to present the effort we have carried out in Chile with the option for applying conservation standards in the Chilean protected areas system. So I'm very thankful for the opportunity. I'm sorry, the audio is not, it's cutting out. So implementing this methodology for conservation and planning in a system which contemplates or entails many different people and organizational structures. The Chilean system consists of a national office, 16 regional offices, and 105 wild protected areas where there are from the local regional level via forest keepers. So an adoption of a new methodology and a new way of working proposes a difficulty which is not minor, which is basically regarding a cultural change in an institution. So the first step for us was obviously to adopt and adapt the methodology for conservation standards, previously called open standards, to the Chilean context and to the institutional reality of CONAF, which is the National Forestry Corporation in Chile. And for this, we used the open standards manual, the conservation standards back from 2013, under which we adopted and generated a manual in 2015, which we put to test in protected areas, and then we adjusted in order to have a final planning manual in 2017. But this process was not a simple one, was not easy, nor was it short. It was a process with much effort. And the first thing done was to create a network of specialists at the local and central level as well. And the first effort was a diagnostics on the methodology that was being applied before, an internal one for planning protected areas and diagnostics of how this was being carried out. And this was also compared to the conservation standards methodology. And so jointly, we were able to develop this adaptation of the CMP manual from 2013. We had a process of technical validation with different teams nationwide in order to train them first on what this methodology was about and how we would be able to adapt and adopt it to our way of working on conservation and protected areas on specific projects with territorial outlook in order to put it to the test on some pilot programs in 2 protected areas as an example that we used for understanding whether this could really be applied within our protected areas. And based on that, we developed this first version of the manual in 2015. And through this manual, we were now able to start applying it in order to start planning. But second stage, once we adapted this method to the Chilean context and to the institution's reality, we were able to create a new version of the manual based on the examples applied, based on the first 4 management plans that were made and formalized in 2017. And so a new version of the planning manual was made, adjusting for some aspects that we saw we needed to adjust, for instance, to include zoning issues that were not included in the methodology for 2013 and conservation standards. And so we developed the first 4 plans for protected areas management. Now we have 6 plans already developed and 28 other plans that are currently in process of implementation. So this was the second stage of starting to develop management plans for protected areas based on this manual that was adopted from the open standards. But clearly, planning is not sufficient. Having a management plan for a protected area is not enough. We needed to arrive to a next step, and for this purpose, the third step implemented was to create a conceptual model of the protected areas system. So it was not enough having the protected areas with their plan and speaking with the conservation standards language, but as a system, we needed to speak the same language. And so for that, what we did was to build a conceptual model for the system on what are the main lines that we need to strengthen in order to really implement the conservation standards at the protected area system and not only at the local area level, including aspects as conservation strategies, monitoring issues, strengthening capacities, community contact will get involved in what we were achieving and also public use issues. But in having this conceptual model, we also um, saw that this new methodology posed many challenges at each of the stages for planning or at each of the stages for the adaptive cycle. For instance, we needed to adopt the monitoring and strengthen our capacities as to not only be able to plan but also implement conservation strategies somehow. And we also needed to have strengthening of our capability to strategically communicate what we were doing. Therefore, this new way of planning opened up, not only did it help us to plan, but it also opened up many possibilities for development that we needed to strengthen. So the fourth step was to strengthen our capacities. This was one of the main and systematic and ongoing steps. We continued doing it every year, ever since we started to develop this effort under this methodology, strengthening capacities, especially from local teams, forest rangers, as well as the regional and central levels, capacity in terms of planning, but also related to monitoring. And this is one of the main efforts which I believe has been most relevant in order to really be able to adapt the institutional culture as to be able to adopt the conservation standards really as a language for working under the protected area system in Chile. So not only did we train staff from the regions or from the protected areas themselves, but we also trained ourselves. And here I would like to thank part of the CCNet team with Felix and Oscar who had us going through an intensive training and advance also regarding conservation standards back in 2019 or 2020. I don't remember it too well, but in order to strengthen our capacities, not only as CONAF, but also for all public services which have some role, or even NGOs which play a role in conservation in Chile. And the next step was a key one, which was adjusting expectations. Obviously, by having new management plans, and this was only an example, but for instance, the Pan de Azúcar National Park planning plan, where we have many strategies and conceptual models for chain of results. And often the teams or the staff there is quite limited. Resources are also limited, and there's little staff out on the field. So we needed to adjust expectations for developing these plans in us to be able to implement them, and so that the protected areas teams did not or do not get demotivated for not being able to implement everything they had planned for. And for this purpose, what we did was to apply flag strategies, as we call them, strategies whereby every protected area with a management plan in all protected areas in the country, in the language of the open standards or conservation standards, they would select their priority threats out of everything that has already been planned for. They would select priority threats as to implement a strategy for it, then assess whether they are effective or not, assess whether they need to continue being implemented or whether the strategy needs to be modified or activities need to be adjusted for to select new threats. And as this progresses, we can learn from each protected areas to assess whether strategies are effective or not. And this is how we adjust expectations or not on not to implement everything, as it would be impossible to implement all activities for a management plan. But we would start learning and using this language for planning in protected areas for those areas which are priority or those threats which are priority to each area. This is just an example of this flag strategy. In the case of the Pandasucar National Park, there's a threat from dogs mainly, where thanks to a management plan appearing in 2016 for the Pandasucar National Park, this was selected as the priority threat to start working on conservation strategies. Therefore, this kind of strategy also serves to communicate how we are progressing in these processes, and also to start training ourselves and improving our way of performing this adaptive management. Next step, which is very important as well, because when we implement, we strengthen our capacity for planning and implementing conservation strategies. We needed to strengthen our monitoring capacities. And in order to strengthen our monitoring capacity, we needed tools which were cost effective for the reasons mentioned before, that we have limited resources and limited staff. Therefore, we need to seek those tools which allow us to obtain better information with at a less cost, and for us to be able to make management decisions based on that monitoring tool. And for this purpose, we developed a processes of setting up monitoring standards, four types or four ways of performing monitoring, which are different but that complement each other, and jointly they tackle most of monitoring objectives, and also for threats ongoing in the area, monitoring of wetlands or satellite monitoring for wetlands, and also camera assisted monitoring or trap camera monitoring, also monitoring via drones or non piloted aerial vehicles, which also allow us to tackle certain goals that other methodologies do not allow to. And we are just starting to develop a process as to adapt also the smart monitoring tool based on patrolling parks in order to take advantage of all the patrolling effort in protected areas, with the goal of having systematic monitoring of conservation objectives or targets as well as their threats. So with these four monitoring lines that we're trying to strengthen and which are cost effective, we can now start making decisions on management based on results. And a seventh step, which for us turns into more important every time, is to strengthen our capacities for community participation and community contact, especially with local communities that are related to the wild protected areas, indigenous or non-indigenous. And for this, we developed two parallel processes. First, we generated a new framework for action for community participation, where we um, provided certain decision-making power and new governance, local governance models to the community, so that these planning processes not only stay within CONAF, but we can also have communities participating in management of the protected areas. And on the other hand, we are just finishing a project which is a guide for participatory planning, because we noticed that our planning manual, describes the methodology of conservation standards. Obviously, we can read it ourselves and understand it, but we must not assume that local communities will be able to read, and when we have them participate in a management plan, that they should also be able to understand what planning entails under the open standards model or the methodology in general. And for this purpose, we generated a guide for participatory planning, where we briefly explain each of the most critical steps in making a management plan for protected areas, using a language which is closer to the communities. As you can see there, illustrations or drawings that may serve the communities better. And so we are already developing this for training communities on how to plan and have them participate in the decision-making processes of each of the protected areas. And the eighth step was very relevant, since the fifth stage in the adaptive uh, life cycle relates to sharing experiences and learning. And here, an important role has been played for us by the contest for case studies from CCNet, where we participated for a series of reasons. First, in order to communicate what we're doing, and the other reason is for the whole system in Latin America perhaps would be able to learn from our experience. Also, to strengthen communication on what we're doing. We had a change in management in the year 2018, and precisely participating in this process and having won the first prize or the first place in 2018 allowed us to continue with this process in time, not have it halt due to management issues, but to continue reinforcing the fact that we were implementing this new planning methodology was really going to be positive to protected areas management. And this also served us a lot for the further development in the following years. And also last year, we uh, made it into the finalists among, well, in third place with two case studies, one quite similar to what I was telling just now, and then the other one was in National Park La Campana, where a flag strategy in this case was generated for conserving Chilean palm, which is the southernmost palm in the world. Therefore, it was a really relevant story to tell, and we hope that in the following contests or world contests to continue participating there and showing how we are progressing at each of our steps. And we're also not only sharing the experience outward, but we have a learning, an internal learning process where we start standardizing everything that we are learning and communicating this among protected areas, among regions in the protected area systems. And that is how we can all learn together from those experiences which are most useful, or those strategies which really allow to reduce some of the threats in protected areas. Finally, the following steps, next steps relate to two main issues. One is strengthening those aspects which relate to human welfare or human well-being. I understand that even in conservation standards tackle this topic more every time, and we are convinced that human well-being is a very relevant aspect to be able to develop planning processes, participative, participatory processes, in order to have people make sense of their effort. And for this, we are building on a theoretical framework on how to tackle human well-being, also considering what they have been working on in FOSS. And we're also working on indicators as to assess how we're doing in improving human welfare for local communities. And the another step relates to strengthening our capacity for assessing what we're doing and communicating the experience and adapting management based on the learning. And for this, we're developing a process which was taken from international experiences such as Bush Heritage, where they're generating management reports, and we want to implement a similar tool for reporting on protected areas where we can go year by year assessing how we're doing with the conservation strategy from this flag strategy as well, and how we're doing in managing protected areas in all the domains that the conservation standards methodology entails. Finally, I would like to thank many institutions that have supported us during these 6 or 7 years where we have been working with under the conservation standards. Obviously, to the internal institutional team, especially the park ranger team, more than 500 people who have been incorporating this new learning process, which is not easy. Often these are people who have been working for more than 30 years, working in the same manner. And so changing their institutional manner is not easy. And today we see that the conservation standards language has penetrated quite strongly within the workers in protected areas. And this is very important to us, but also there are many other institutions that have supported us through financial resources as to be able to further develop this new methodology at the technical level via different training events, supporting via different ways. And we would like to thank each and every one of them. Perhaps there are many that have been left out this slide, but it is important that collaboration with different stakeholders to continue that allow us to continue strengthening our capacities and our way for managing protected areas. So thank you so much, and I'll be expecting any questions, any doubts, any concerns, and I would like to once again thank you for the invitation. I will be expecting also for an opportunity to support any further efforts. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Wow, that's an amazing story and journey that you guys have been on. Incredible. I think something for me that really jumped out was what you said right at the end about how that even through a change in management, you were able to carry on with that same process because it had been demonstrated as being effective. I think that's really interesting. Lots of lessons learned for other protected area networks across the world, I think. Absolutely. So we have a few moments of questions. Does anybody want to jump in and ask a question? You can raise your hand or also just speak up. Giselle?
Yeah, I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you so much. My question is about, and I know it, even though it's several years in the making, it's still a long haul to implement, but I'm curious how you envision within sites and across sites, like managing that data of implementation and results and actually doing that and doing the evaluation. So where's your thinking on like how that part of this whole cycle is going to happen?
Sí, muchas gracias por la pregunta. A ver,
Thank you so much for the question. So indeed, what we are seeking now at this time is to be really able for the planning language for conservation standards. We have already been able to incorporate it. We have already incorporated it into our institutional culture. Now we need to strengthen each of those stages and especially learning from our management. And as I was saying, one of the aspects that we attempted to strengthen, since often resources are not what one would wish for, especially human resources are quite limited, we need to know where to focus on where the priorities are and being able to acknowledge those processes that allow us to learn, identifying those processes that allow us to learn, for example, via flag conservation strategies, where the local teams define and plan in one way strategies for implementation in a specific project in order to tackle a threat. That has allowed us to learn, and we are generating annual reports, annual briefs, where the same team are assessing year to year what are the results from their management, whether something has changed in the situation in the protected area within the year. And we have much accumulated knowledge there, and we have been sharing that year to year among the teams, and also every time generating more links to other stakeholders, which also allow us to assess it from the outside, which is quite relevant for us. Not only having our own internal assessment, but for other stakeholders to allow us to have an external assessment of our management, but especially generating systematic processes for strategy implementation, for standardization of results, and communicating also those results nationwide. And for that purpose, I was saying that one of the next steps is to implement a management brief or report where we are able to see the priority management at each protected area and what are their results year to year, and the progress on those results has to be able to adapt our management.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great question, Giselle. Paulina.
Mariana, muchas gracias por esta presentación. Excelente.
The audio is slow, but it says, Mariano, thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. Can you hear me? I have a question on, is that bioculture? You mentioned that there was much effort in changing the way of thinking in the institution.
I didn't know if it was me. Hello? Can you hear
Now
me?
we can hear you. Yeah.
Now I
Okay.
can hear you.
Mariano, gracias la presentación.
Mariano, thank you for the presentation. One question on cultural change that you mentioned many times. What is what best worked for you in order to achieve or to facilitate precisely that change in culture the change for people's way of thinking? What was the most effective strategy for that? Thank you so much, Paulina, for your question. That is a key question, which was key for us at the beginning because we knew that cultural change was the hardest part. Perhaps adjusting the methodology to our reality was not as difficult, but really being able for more than 500 people to change their way of working year to year. And what had more results for us, and which I believe was most key, was to create what we call a network of planning, which happened at the beginning of the process. We defined a group of 30 people within CONAP, from forest rangers to protected areas administrators, professionals centrally and locally or regionally. They were tasked in performing this diagnostic. So it was not us from the central part to tell the whole country, hey, you're changing your way of working from today. But we generated a working team of about 30 people. Obviously, this needed to include people from every domain, from forest rangers to management staff in the institution. And from there, we decided with those 30 people that it was necessary to have this change. And this brought a very strong backing to the effort that we later carried out. It is very probable that if we had defined this centrally and had imposed it as a way of working, it would have lasted for very little. So, and the institutional change would not have been possible. So I think this was the key point that allowed us that from the foundation of the institution to have this backing on the idea that we really needed to change, and working together on how to do it, I think was a critical step in order to have all of the later effort, all the effort that came later.
Great, thank you very much. So that's perfect timing to move on to our next speaker, but I'm sure if there are any questions for Mariano, he'd be happy to either answer them in the chat or via email. So thank you again for sharing your story, really, really interesting. Our next speaker